I never expected my straight boss to drive me home that night, let alone take the long way. It was a Friday evening in late September, and the office had mostly emptied out by 7 p.m. I was still hunched over my desk, trying to finish a project report that was due on Monday. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across my keyboard as I typed furiously, determined to get everything done before the weekend truly began. That's when I heard his voice. "Still burning the midnight oil, huh?" I looked up to see Marcus leaning against my cubicle wall, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder, tie loosened just enough to suggest he was ready for the weekend, but not quite there yet. Marcus had been my boss for about 8 months. He was the kind of manager everyone secretly hoped for, demanding but fair, with a dry sense of humor that made even the most tedious meetings bearable. At 37, he was only about 5 years older than me, but the difference felt more significant somehow. Maybe it was the easy confidence he carried, or the way he commanded respect without ever having to raise his voice. Or maybe it was just the wedding band on his finger that created that invisible barrier between us. "Just wrapping up?" I said, saving my document and stretching my arms above my head. "Lost track of time." He nodded, glancing at his watch. "It's getting late. How are you getting home?" I hadn't thought about it. Usually, I'd take the subway, but at this hour, the trains ran less frequently, and the 15-minute wait felt particularly unappealing after a long week. "Subway, I guess," I replied, already dreading the journey. "I can give you a ride," he offered casually, as if it wasn't completely unexpected. "I'm heading in that direction anyway." Now, I should mention that in the 8 months I'd worked under Marcus, we developed what I can only describe as a complicated dynamic. Nothing inappropriate had ever happened. We were both consummate professionals, but there was something there. A lingering glance during meetings. The way he'd sometimes touch my shoulder when making a point. How he seemed to seek out my opinion even when it wasn't strictly necessary. Small things that could be nothing, but sometimes felt like something. I hesitated for just a moment before accepting his offer. What else was I going to do? Spend 40 minutes on public transit when a perfectly good ride was being offered? Besides, I told myself, it was just a drive home. Nothing more. The office where we worked was a mid-sized marketing firm in the city center, housed in a renovated industrial building with exposed brick walls and 2 mini glass partitions. It was the kind of place that tried very hard to appear creative and cutting-edge while still serving primarily corporate clients. Our team consisted of about 20 people, a mix of account managers, creatives, and strategists. I joined as a content strategist after leaving a larger agency, drawn by the promise of more responsibility and creative freedom. Marcus had been brought in shortly after I started, tasked with turning our department around after a period of stagnation. He'd done exactly that, implementing new processes and bringing in fresh talent. Under his leadership, we'd landed 3 major clients in 6 months. People respected him for his results, but they also genuinely liked him, a rare combination in our industry. Our working relationship had always been positive. He valued my input and gave me increasing responsibility as I proved myself. But there was always that undercurrent, that spark of something that made me hyper-aware of his presence. I'd catch myself fixing my hair before meetings with him or feeling unreasonably pleased when he laughed at my jokes. I dismissed these feelings as a harmless work crush, the kind that makes Monday mornings a little more bearable but never amounts to anything. As we walked to the parking garage together, I was acutely conscious of the shift in context. At work, our roles were clearly defined. Outside, in the dim light of the garage with the sound of our footsteps echoing against concrete, those boundaries seemed less certain. His car was exactly what I would have expected, a black Audi, immaculately clean and smelling faintly of leather and some subtle cologne. I slid into the passenger seat, suddenly aware of how intimate a car can feel. The confined space, the proximity, the fact that we were alone together for the first time without the buffer of work between us. "So," he said, starting the engine, "where am I taking you?" I gave him my address in the eastern part of the city, about 15 minutes away with normal traffic. He nodded, pulling out of the garage and onto the street. The city was transformed at night, all neon lights and shadowy corners. Friday evening traffic moved steadily around us as people headed home or out to dinner, eager to start their weekends. The first few minutes in the car were filled with the kind of small talk that colleagues fall back on when they suddenly find themselves in a personal situation. We discussed the project I'd been working on, a particularly difficult client who'd been causing headaches all week, and an upcoming company event. Safe topics that kept us firmly in professional territory. I couldn't help but notice things about Marcus I'd never had the chance to observe before. The way he drove with one hand on the wheel, confident but not aggressive. How he had a habit of tapping his fingers against the steering wheel when we stopped at red lights. The small scar near his right eyebrow that I'd never been close enough to notice before. "Mind if I put on some music?" he asked, breaking a momentary silence. "Not at all," I replied, curious about what he would choose. He connected his phone to the car's system, and the sounds of a jazz quartet filled the space between us. Not what I would have expected, but somehow fitting. "You like jazz?" I asked, genuinely surprised. He smiled, keeping his eyes on the road. "My dad played saxophone. I grew up with it." It was such a small piece of personal information, but it felt significant somehow. In all our professional interactions, we rarely shared details about our lives outside work. Now I had this little fragment of who Marcus was beyond the office, and I found myself wanting more. As we approached an intersection where he should have turned right to follow the most direct route to my apartment, Marcus hesitated, then continued straight. "Sorry," he said, noticing my confusion. "There's always terrible traffic on 5th at this hour. I know a better way." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. The route he was taking wasn't exactly a detour, but it certainly wasn't the most direct path either. It would add at least 10 minutes to our journey. Was he deliberately extending our time together, or was I reading too much into a simple choice of route? The new path took us along the river, where the city skyline reflected in the dark water. It was undeniably more scenic than the direct route would have been. Street lamps cast pools of golden light onto the road, and the buildings across the water were lit up like jewels against the night sky. "This is beautiful," I said, looking out at the view. "I don't come this way often enough." "It's one of my favorite drives in the city," he replied. "Especially at night. During the day, you just see the traffic and the tourists, but at night." He gestured toward the view. "You see what makes this place special." There was something in his voice, a softness, a hint of the person behind the professional facade, that made my heart beat a little faster. The conversation began to shift then, moving away from work and into more personal territory. He asked about my background, where I grew up, what had brought me to this city. I found myself sharing stories I hadn't planned to tell, about my college years, my first disastrous job in the industry, the novel I'd been trying to write for years but never seemed to finish. In turn, he told me about his childhood in a small coastal town, his initial plan to become an architect before marketing caught his interest, his recent separation from his wife. A detail that made me suddenly aware of the absence of his wedding ring, something I hadn't noticed until that moment. "It's been final for about 2 months," he explained when I couldn't hide my surprise. "We've been living apart for almost a year, but I only recently stopped wearing the ring. Old habits, I guess." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it despite the flutter of something that might have been hope in my chest. "That must be difficult." He shrugged, his profile illuminated briefly by passing headlights. "It was for a while. But sometimes things just run their course, you know? We wanted different things, different lives. Better to admit that than pretend everything's fine." I nodded, thinking about my own failed relationships and how they had ended for similar reasons. There's something uniquely painful about realizing that love isn't always enough, that sometimes compatibility matters more than passion. "What about you?" he asked after a moment. "Anyone special in your life?" The question hung between us, loaded with potential meanings. Was this just friendly conversation, or was he fishing for information? And why did it matter so much to me either way? "Not at the moment," I answered truthfully. "My last relationship ended about 6 months ago. Work keeps me busy enough that I haven't really been looking." He nodded, and I thought I detected a slight smile. Work has a way of doing that, becoming the perfect excuse. "Is that what it is for you?" I asked, feeling bold. "An excuse?" He glanced at me briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just easier to focus on something I know I'm good at while the rest of my life is in flux." There was such honesty in his admission that I felt compelled to match it. "I understand that. Sometimes it's easier to pour yourself into work than to risk being hurt again." "Exactly," he said softly. "Though at some point, you have to ask yourself if you're moving forward or just running in place." The conversation continued like that as we drove, winding through parts of the city I rarely visited. We passed illuminated storefronts and restaurants with outdoor seating where people laughed and drank wine under string lights. The world outside the car seemed distant somehow, as if we were in our own bubble, protected from reality by glass and metal and the gentle soundtrack of jazz. I realized with a start that I was enjoying myself more than I had in months. There was something freeing about this unexpected time together, removed from the constraints of our usual roles. Here, we weren't boss and employee, but just two people sharing a drive and a conversation. The attraction I'd been trying to ignore at work seemed less complicated in this context, though I knew that was an illusion. As we talked, I noticed that Marcus had taken yet another turn that extended our journey. This time, he didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. Part of me didn't want the drive to end, didn't want to return to the reality where our relationship was defined by organizational hierarchies and professional boundaries. "Can I ask you something?" he said after a comfortable silence had settled between us. "Something that's not related to work?" My pulse quickened. Of course. He hesitated, as if carefully choosing his words. "Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you know what the right thing to do is, but it's at odds with what you want?" The question felt loaded, personal in a way that transcended our usual interactions. I considered how to respond, aware that we might be approaching dangerous territory. "Yes," I finally answered. "More times than I can count. I think that's just part of being an adult, isn't it? Navigating that gap between desire and responsibility." He nodded slowly. "And how do you decide when those two things are in conflict?" I looked out at the city passing by, gathering my thoughts. "I think it depends on the potential consequences, on who might get hurt. Sometimes what seems like the right thing is just what's expected, not what's actually right." "That's an interesting distinction," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Between what's expected and what's right." The car slowed as we approached a red light, and in that moment of stillness, I felt the full weight of the conversation we were really having, the one beneath the surface. We were talking about us, about the attraction neither of us had acknowledged but both clearly felt, about the professional boundaries that kept us from exploring it. The light turned green, and Marcus accelerated gently, his hands steady on the wheel. "I've been thinking about making some changes," he said after a moment. "In my life, in my career." "What kind of changes?" I asked, watching his profile in the dim light. "I've been offered a position at another agency. Better title, better pay, different challenges." He paused. "I haven't decided yet if I'm going to take it." The news hit me with unexpected force. The thought of not seeing Marcus every day, of working under someone else, made me realize just how important his presence had become to me. "Would you want to take it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral, setting aside the practical benefits. He seemed to consider this carefully. "There are things I would miss about my current position, people I would miss working with." Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment, I understood what he wasn't saying. If he took this new job, we would no longer be in a reporting relationship. The professional barrier between us would disappear. "When do you have to decide?" I asked. "By the end of next week," he replied. "It's not a decision I'm taking lightly." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to encourage him to take the opportunity, to open the door to possibilities between us. Another part feared what might happen if those possibilities never materialized, if I had misread the entire situation. We were getting closer to my apartment now, the familiar landmarks of my neighborhood appearing outside the window. Our extended journey was coming to an end, and I felt a mixture of anticipation and regret. What would happen when we arrived? Would this newfound intimacy survive outside the confines of his car, or would we retreat back into our professional personas? As Marcus turned onto my street, the tension in the car seemed to intensify. He pulled up in front of my building and put the car in park, but left the engine running. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the jazz playing softly in the background. "Thank you for the ride," I said finally, my hand resting on the door handle but making no move to open it. "And for taking the scenic route." He smiled, turning slightly to face me. "Thank you for the company." It made the drive home much more enjoyable. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. I knew I should get out of the car, say goodnight, and walk away. That would be the sensible thing to do. But something kept me rooted to the spot, unwilling to end this moment. "Marcus," I began, not entirely sure what I wanted to say. "Yes." His voice was soft, expectant. "Whatever you decide about the job offer, I hope it makes you happy." His expression softened. That means a lot to me. Another silence fell between us, this one charged with possibility. I was acutely aware of how close we were sitting, of how easy it would be to lean across the center console and kiss him. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. Instead, I reached for the door handle again, this time opening it. I should go, I said, though every part of me wanted to stay. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Have a good weekend. As I stepped out of the car, the cool night air cleared my head slightly. I turned back before closing the door. Drive safely. I will, he promised. See you Monday. I closed the door and walked toward my building, feeling his eyes on me the entire way. At the entrance, I turned and waved, watching as he pulled away from the curb and drove off into the night. Standing there, key in hand, I replayed the evening in my mind. The unexpected offer of a ride. The deliberate choice to take the long way. The conversations that had moved steadily from professional to personal. The revelation about his separation. The job offer that could change everything. I didn't know what would happen on Monday when we returned to the office, whether we would acknowledge this shift between us or pretend it never happened. I didn't know if Marcus would take the new position, removing the professional barriers that kept us apart. I didn't know if what I felt was real attraction or just the forbidden appeal of something I couldn't have. But as I entered my apartment and closed the door behind me, I knew one thing with certainty. That drive home had changed something between us, had opened a door that couldn't easily be closed again. Whatever came next, whether we acted on this connection or let it fade away, that night would remain a turning point. The night my straight boss drove me home and took the long way, giving us both the time and space to see each other as something more than just colleagues. And perhaps that was enough for now. This acknowledgement of possibility, this shared secret of what might be. Sometimes the journey matters more than the destination, and sometimes the longest route leads exactly where you need to go. Total _count, 13,987.